things first, is that Los Angeles? That's genuinely what popped into my head when I saw that opening shot for the episode. Because if you've seen recent photos of LA, that ain't far off. Apocalypse indeed, makes you think. So on that somewhat lighter moment, let me just say, wow, Neil Druckmann, he's a pretty dark dude that he came up with all this stuff. Because while episode 8 might have gone back to being written by Craig Mazin, once again, this show stays very close to the source material, even down to some of the shots. I was wondering, I was like, that's an amazing shot. Is that from the game? And it is! But here, I think there are 3 elements that greatly change the feel of this chapter. And I wonder if you agree with me. Share your thoughts down below. Number 1. In the video game, when David and Ellie are waiting for James to return, they're actually attacked by a swarm of infected and work together to fight them off. And that creates a fighter-survivalist bond, which further complicates Ellie's connection with David, muddies the waters as to whether or not he's a good or bad guy at that point in the conversation. I wonder if you played the game, if you were waiting for the infected to show up while they were sitting there, and then you were like, where's the infected? There are no infected on this show. When we watched episode 5 with that incredible pit that erupted, I was like, and many of you agreed, that this was where the show needed to be. This is the level it needed to be Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon level entertainment. But it's never gone back to that. Instead, it's opted to go all in on human horror rather than zombie horror. And I wonder how you and others feel about that. I'm okay with it. I appreciate this show for what it is, even though it didn't sell itself this way. But I do also feel that a human horror show is less popular, on the broad spectrum than a zombie horror show. If I was an HBO exec, because this has already been greenlit for the 2nd season to tell the story of the game sequel, I would say, Neil, Craig, I love what you're doing, baby. But for season 2, we need more infected. And I wonder how you feel about, I guess the infected often factor in to the gameplay, and a lot of the gameplay elements have been removed, but I would have found a way to keep them in there, right? I always feel like when I've done creative writing, at the top of my outline in my notes, I always put the top things that I feel that are touchstones for what I'm writing. I did this when I wrote my comic book Superbia. And I was like, these elements have to be in every issue or episode. And I feel like at the top of when they were writing out the outlines and the scripts for this show, they should have been infected. It should have been at the top of their noteboard, being like, don't forget about the infected. 2, in the game and in interviews with the actor who did David's mocap, video game legend Nolan North. If you don't know who that is, if you don't play video games, I look all this stuff up and do my research. So I know who Nolan North is from when I was covering the Uncharted movie. He did the mocap for Nathan Drake originally. Nolan North, always a bridesmaid, never the bride. He's like, why aren't I on the show? Because, speaking of video game legends, that's Troy Baker as James, and he's the OG Joel. That's Joel in the games. Troy Baker is a legend, legend in the world of video games. He's done so many great, famous games that I'm sure even those of you who don't play video games have heard of. So I was really surprised that he had so few lines in this episode. I was like, you guys are making it seem like Troy Baker can't act. And I've heard him do a lot of voiceover. He can act. So that was weird to me. That was weird. Maybe he's not good at the face acting, but because he did mocap and he does voice work, but maybe his face needs work. I don't know, but I thought that was really surprising. I thought he was going to have I thought at first he was going to be David when I first heard he was in this episode, but that's crazy. So back to David, and again, based on what Neil Druckmann has said in interviews and what I read about the game, and also interviews with Nolan North, who mocapped the character, because people are asking him about, David's such a complex character, people were like, did we see what we thought we saw? And Nolan North clarified. And so that romantic interest that David has in Ellie, I think is explained a little bit better, with factors like less and less females in the group. I hate that term, but I think David would use it. And also David having some messed up idea that it's up to him to repopulate the earth. Also, there was a continued line in the game that David liked to keep series of pets. Pets, which are like involuntary groupies or Patty Hearst style groupies. And they kind of, I think, hinted at that a little bit with the daughter of that the guy who Joel killed, who's around Ellie's age. But she didn't seem that into David at all. So I think the situation could have been, set up to have the nuances that it did in the game. And then 3, and I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this, I think David on the show is miscast. With all due respect to Scott Shepard, who certainly goes for it, he comes across more as a religious leader to me and not the cult leader that David is in the game. It's hard to understand, at least to me, why that group doesn't just shoot David. Because we see a heck of a lot of stick and no carrot in terms of how he's running the group. I was like, well, what does David do that's good? Because I'm just seeing a lot of bad. Also, he's not at all charismatic, in my opinion. I think right away you're like, that guy's creepy. And in the game, that's what I believe, based on what I've seen, made David such a surprise. That he seemed like a cool dude, and then he turns out to be a monster. Like, for instance, Pedro Pascal is incredibly likable, as everybody knows. The internet just falls more in love with him every press event. But you try to forgive Joel for his transgressions. But with this David, the guy they cast as David, you're like, again, why are we following this guy? He doesn't have the power of the church behind him. I don't really think he was that religious in this episode. And he needs to have the power of personality to drive his cult. And he don't got it. I see very little personality here. So what are the themes of this episode, besides really messing Ellie up physically and mentally? Well, once again, this show continues to be quite impressive because this stuff is amazing. Wow. And it only really occurred to me on the second watch. So I'm so glad to be able to share my observations with you. I mean, at first you're just like, this is very disturbing. And then when you see, because then you're like, is it just disturbing for the point of being disturbing? And then when you take a closer look, you're like, well, actually, it's genius. So David says he got the idea for his cult, not from religion or God, but from the Cordyseps, the infection, which is amazing, right? He gets into the minds of his cult members, and religion is like carbs, the sweet, sweet delivery system that maybe you shouldn't be eating. His words are like the tendrils that come out of the mouth of the infected. Get it? Words come out of the mouth too? Oh, I love that. I love that a lot. And now, just like the infected, they mindlessly follow his directive. Just like humans who are infected with cordyceps do the will of the cordyceps. Oh, I like that. I like that a lot. Now, I don't think the execution of this idea or this metaphor is as convincing as it could be with better casting for David. But still, it's an amazing idea that someone would look at the horror of cordyceps and be like, great idea. I could do that. And that this is the human representation of cordyceps. And in some ways, it's like saying this is just the cycle of life. You know, it exists in nature, so now it exists with humanity. I just think it's really a fascinating idea. Then next, as Neil Druckmann has put it, David is a warped father figure in contrast to Joel. Yikes, right? Woo, Joel's like, don't drag me into this. But it's still, when you look at it from an analytical perspective, it's a true statement. I think David even hints that he feels Joel looks at Ellie the same way that he does, because he creepily says that Joel killed his guy to protect Ellie, insinuating that Joel, like him, sees Ellie more as a commodity than a person. So I thought that was very interesting. And also, I think it points out how lucky Ellie is that she got paired up with Joel. Because, well, obviously, things could have been a lot worse. Or is she lucky to be with Joel? Because this episode, for the first time, we truly meet Dark Joel. As The Last of Us, I feel, starts to slowly shift to vilifying the character. Or do they? The gray zones of this show, I think, are why so many of you like it so much. And what's really, I find, very appealing as well. Because I don't think these actions vilify Joel, but I think that, again, it creates a debate, because maybe some of you do. I don't see how any of you could, but, you're free to make your case down below. To me, this show has taken me on the emotional journey of Joel and Ellie. I've gone from an episode 4, as you might recall, saying maybe they didn't have to kill that guy, to like, you should definitely kill these twisted, brainwashed mofos. Take them out, Joel. To me, Joel goes all Batman this episode. But again, some people don't approve of Batman's methods, but they don't know what crime is like in Gotham. So you see where I'm going here. I mean, who is against Joel and Batman? In my opinion, I don't see how you could be. I don't understand you, my friend, but I'm willing to hear you out. Favorite shot of the episode? Joel in the snow with all his weapons racing to get Ellie. That is the cover of something right there. Video game, comic book, movie. It was amazing. I love it. And I used it as part of the poster frame for this episode. What an amazing shot. What a nice thing for Pedro Pascal. He should be like, can we frame that and get it to me in a frame and I could put it on my wall? Because that's so cool. It wouldn't even bother me that he has a picture of himself on his own wall, because I'm like, that's incredible. You should have that on your wall. I thought it was fantastic how the show set up Joel still fighting off an infection, but having to and being able to take out 3 dudes. I was like, Joel, I like this version of you. And we get the return of the map trick that was so brilliantly set up earlier, so that when you see it here, you're like, damn. And a killer follow-up. I love that. When the other guy screams, I ain't telling you shit, after he kills the first dude with the map, and Joel says, it's okay, I believe him. Wow, great line, amazing delivery. That's Tarantino level stuff right there. A little Batman-y, as I said, very Batman-y, and I love Batman, so I was loving this episode in that regard. And I love that even though Joel could have saved Ellie, he didn't need to. She saved herself. She has truly become his Robin, to continue with our Batman comparison. And throughout this episode, you can see how well he's trained her over the 3-month time jump. She can track. She's getting better at aiming. She still needs some work. She was a little wide. She can sneak up on people. They even remarked on that. They were like, wow. And I was like, oh, I'm so proud of you, Ellie. And she's super sharp. The way she discharged the bullets from David and James's rifles, that was like a boss. I was like, Ellie, you are so freaking cool. And when she went to lay down next to Joel, hoping he wouldn't die, that's like Batman and Carrie Kelly right there. It's almost an exact frame from that famous Frank Miller comic. Carrie Kelly, in fact, had some dark, traumatizing moments herself as Robin, and she had to be comforted by Batman, who called her good soldier. Joel calls Ellie baby girl, and that's what he used to call his daughter, Sarah. I don't think they drove it home as well as the video game did, but, you know, that's very important that he does that. I think it shows that the emotional transfer is complete. I think someone in a more healthy mental state would have just come up with a new nickname for Ellie. And I think this underscores that Joel, in my opinion, I know some of you don't agree, and maybe this wasn't the case in the games, but I feel on the show, he is using Ellie as a replacement for Sarah rather than building a new relationship. And we'll talk about that more next week when that really blows up in his face. All right, so when did you know what they were eating? Huh? All right, so for me, because I watch a lot of movies and TV, I knew pretty much almost as soon as the episode started. When they told that family that it was too cold to bury Alec and that they would do it later, another side note, watch Nate Bargatze's. He's such a great comedian. Watch all of his comedy specials, but he has a new one recently on Prime Video. He's usually on Netflix, but he jumped to Prime Video, and he has a hilarious little bit in there about how hard it is to dig a hole in the ground. It's so funny. I don't want to even tell you any of the jokes. I want you to go over there and watch it. It's incredible. But I thought of that when they were saying that here. But then as soon as they were like, oh, we can't bury him right now, but don't worry, we're holding him, we'll have his body somewhere. And then James was like, we don't have enough food. And I was like, got it. Now, obviously, to some degree, this is also, I think, a take on the infamous Donner Party. The real true story. Pioneers in the winter of 1846 to 47 who became stuck in the mountains and had to resort to the same desperate, gruesome measures. Now, they only used the dead, but I don't know if David and I've made them a celebrity couple. It's Dames. No, if David and James were so careful. Also, this wasn't their first winter there. It seemed to me like they'd been there at least for like a few years, maybe at least 2. So, I mean, they were like, oh, this winter is rougher than we expected. But it's like, you didn't store enough food and supplies for the winter? I mean, worst case scenario, you have to severely limit rations. So I was like, come on. Because, like, I think David wanted to do this. He says he has a violent heart. Also, they dropped the hint that before the apocalypse, he was a teacher of kids Ellie's age. Uh-oh, red flags everywhere. So these dark tendencies were always there. But now that civilization has fallen, there's no law and police to stop him, no society to shame him. And he's created this cult to support him. But again, I think the cult supporting him is less effective with the casting that they went with. I'm like, just shoot that guy. So that's when I knew. But I think that they wanted the audience to know during the kitchen scene because they telegraphed it so hard. Why did that woman ask what the meat was? And she asked it with like a really scared look on her face, like she didn't want to know. And then why did the guy take so long to answer? And then he's like, oh, venison. And then they bring in the deer after that, still whole and not chopped up. So I think that was the dad Alec they were having for dinner. The show wants so I think the show wants the audience to know by then, and I think the cult knew the whole time. I think the cult knows. I think they just don't want to admit it to themselves. Again, I think they could have really leaned more into the religious aspects of the cult, because they didn't seem that religious to me, to be honest with you. They just seemed all really quiet. Maybe they didn't want to pay to have extras have lines, because then it becomes somebody who has, if you have a line, it significantly changes your pay scale, and it also significantly, you get participation in royalties going forward for when the show airs going ahead of, although there are no royalties anymore because streaming changes that. So I could see maybe that's the only reason I can think why hardly anyone in that cult talked or said anything, where really why they didn't do anything, because they just were basically extras. So I guess seeing the meat locker later is just for shock value and a grim confirmation, like what you suspected is indeed true. We went there with HBO, and they had three. Why did James say they were short on supplies? I also think this cult is an interesting contrast to the commune in Jackson. Warped Joel, warped community. But still, communism, every town meeting in Jackson, I'd raise my hand and say, why can't we do democracy again? Why have we turned our backs on democracy? So let's talk about Ellie's life-changing ordeal this episode. Talk about trauma. So when we start the episode, Joel is infected. Nice fake tummy there, by the way. I was like, that belly button's clearly not real, but I'm impressed with that. But anyway, of course he's infected. As we said last week, that needle and thread were filthy. But luckily, when she gets the jump on David and James, or Dames, I kind of like calling them Dames. But anyway, I was really surprised also that David, especially this version of David, partook in the hunting instead of just outsourcing it. And again, they had three in the meat locker. Why do they even have to go hunting? But anyway, she gets penicillin for Joel. When James threw the penicillin, I was shocked it didn't break. I was like, did you throw that on a hard board? Throw it in the snow, man. I think maybe he wanted it to break, but it didn't. But how much to give him? If only she could Google it. This show, it's fascinating. This and watching old episodes of Seinfeld really remind you how much we rely on technology and for how little technology has been such a big part of mankind's life. But she can't Google it. She just has to guess. I Googled it. I was curious. I was like, how much penicillin do you use? But oh no, it requires math. You have to calculate it with the body weight. Joel, how much do you weigh? Which reminds me of that great bit from, speaking of Batman, the first Batman movie with Batman and Vicky Vale. So if only we had a calculator. I'm sure she could have figured it out, but I'm also sure she did not administer that penicillin correctly. But whatevs, it got the job done, and I looked it up, and it's almost impossible to overdose on penicillin. So seems like that's a good drug. Good for humanity. Yay, humans. All right, so I love the way that David revealed that she and Joel had killed someone in their group. That was brilliant and very scary, the way that it was done, because he was able to manipulate the situation like that so calmly and effectively. Like, she thought she was in control, and he was in control the whole time. That was really cool. As Ellie ran back, I was surprised she didn't make more of an effort to hide her tracks in the snow. I'm like, jump in your own footprints. Who hasn't ever seen that before? I guess their original footprints would have been a problem, but I don't know. I was like, are you running straight back to your hideout? And I was also shocked that fall off the horse didn't kill her. I was like, that's not realistic. And then also, speaking of not realistic, I don't think David could carry her. I was like, I don't think that's possible. In the video game, the meat was stored in the room where she was held in the cage, which makes you wonder what that cage was for usually. As I said, I don't think they restricted it just to their dead. But I thought the ear reveal was much better for Ellie finding out what was going on there. I thought that was, I liked the subtlety of that. I thought that was excellent. And the way she was able to stop them from, serving her up was by revealing she was infected. And boy, Ellie, way to hold on to your cards until you need them and then play them at the exact right moment. That gives David, and particularly James, just enough pause for her to get away. Kind of, because then we have the restaurant showdown, which, just like the game, is visually stunning. I loved that, talk about things escalating, that the embers from that charred wood, that was so cool right there. That was awesome. The way the place just went up like kindling, that was awesome. So you have this preacher who, very, very Frollo from A Hunchback of Notre Dame in some regard. But you have this preacher who likes to say he's created a heaven, but when he's really an agent of hell. I love it. I love turning a good religious metaphor on its head. And I loved his line that she couldn't possibly be infected because she's fighting too hard to stay alive. I was like, you got me there, you got me there. And it's a great flourish on that note that just as Ellie is able to hold off and beat the Cordyceps, she's able to hold off the human version as well, David. That's also so poetically beautiful. He almost gets, let's say, the better of her, and this reminded me of the equally ridiculous scene in Quantum of Solace where a man tries to force the same situation where a building is coming down around them. Like, really? David's even stabbed in the gut or the side and is probably bleeding out. So anyway, another week, another horrifying experience for poor Ellie and Joel. One episode left for this season, full of fantastic payoffs. I can't wait to share them with you next week. But that's my breakdown of this episode, and I'm very excited to hear your thoughts on this deep dive, because there's like a lot here, actually, yet again. So share your thoughts down below, subscribe today, see you next week for the season finale, and of course, as always, you can check out some more videos right now.